March 14, 1992. 6 days before Johnny Carson's final Tonight Show taping, an envelope arrived at NBC Studios, Burbank, California. No return address, no cover letter, just a single name written across the front in violet ink, the handwriting of the most famous woman in the world. Inside was a photograph that had never been published anywhere, a photograph that should not have existed, and on the back, a single sentence: "You were the only one who came." Johnny Carson held that photograph for 11 minutes without speaking. When his producer walked in and asked if he was ready for that evening's taping, he was still holding it. He said 5 words: "Get me Elizabeth Taylor." That photograph had been taken on the worst night of Elizabeth Taylor's life. A night in 1961 that had been erased from every record, every biography, every account of this extraordinary life. A night when Elizabeth Taylor was completely alone in a hotel room in Rome, and only one person in the world knew where she was, and that person had come. Tonight, on one of his final broadcasts, Elizabeth Taylor was going to tell 40 million Americans what Johnny Carson did in that hotel room. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. To understand this story, we need to go back 31 years, to November of 1961. Elizabeth Taylor that autumn was the most talked about woman in the world, not out of admiration, but out of hatred. The Rome production of Cleopatra had turned into the most expensive film in Hollywood history, and at the center of the chaos was Elizabeth. She was married to Eddie Fisher, but her affair with Richard Burton on set was no longer a secret. The Vatican publicly condemned them. Fan letters had been replaced by death threats. From the outside, it was a scandal. From the inside, a 29-year-old woman was falling apart in front of the entire world. We need to clarify something here. The story you are about to hear is constructed from the documented details of 2 real lives. The facts about Elizabeth Taylor are true. The facts about Johnny Carson are true. The encounter between them, lives in the space between what we know and what we feel, must have been true. Grand Hotel, Rome, room 714. Elizabeth Taylor checked in on November 17th under a false name. She had no luggage, just a small handbag. When the brass room key was placed in her palm, heavy, cold, with 714 inches engraved on it, the woman who took it was not the most famous star in the world. She was simply a very tired, very lonely, and very frightened human being. But the real beginning of this story has not arrived yet. On the other side of the Atlantic, in New York, a 36-year-old television host was fighting his own war. Johnny Carson had been hosting The Tonight Show for 3 years. Ratings were unstable. NBC was growing impatient. His first marriage had collapsed. Jody had taken the children and gone back to Nebraska. Johnny smiled at millions every night, but the man who returned to his Manhattan apartment when the camera stopped was someone who left the smile at the door. As Ed McMahon recalled years later, in 1961, Johnny was 2 different people. One was the Johnny America saw, the other nobody wanted to see. And it was at exactly this point that the world would bring them together. November 19th, 1961, 2:47 a.m. Johnny Carson's telephone rang. He picked up on the 4th ring. On the other end, a familiar voice, but one that sounded nothing like any version of her he had ever known. Stripped of premieres, galas, press conferences, trembling, almost childlike. Johnny, just his name. "Then I am calling from Rome, the Grand Hotel. I think you are the only person I can call." Johnny sat up in bed. The weight of the sentence settled over the night. Elizabeth continued, her voice calm, but beneath the calm was the tone of someone gathering the last fragments of control. "Eddie is done. Richard is done. All of it is done. I am in room 714 right now, and I wanted to talk to you." One more time, Johnny Carson understood at that moment the true meaning of the words on the other end of the line. Johnny did two things. First, he kept Elizabeth on the line. Calm, steady, neither therapy nor lecture. He simply talked about Nebraska, about his father's repair shop, about ordinary human things, deliberately small. He could hear her breathing slow, the emptiness in her voice beginning to recede. The second thing he did was far bigger. At 3:40 a.m., he called his producer. Cancel the Monday and Tuesday tapings. Report a technical failure. The producer objected. Do it, Johnny said, and hung up. That producer would say years later, Johnny Carson never missed a single day in 30 years. That night, he did something that to this day I do not fully understand why. At 4:15 a.m., he hailed a taxi toward JFK Airport, still wearing the suit he had come home in, unshaven, nothing in his wallet but cash and a passport. 9 hours later, he walked into the marble lobby of the Grand Hotel. He gave the front desk a name that was not his own. The night manager's eyes widened briefly, then silently handed him the key to the 7th floor. When he knocked on the door of room 714, the Elizabeth Taylor who opened it was nearly unrecognizable. No makeup, hair disheveled, wrapped in the hotel's white bathrobe. Her eyes were swollen but dry, the eyes of someone who had finished crying long ago, and the expression in those famous violet eyes was pure astonishment. "You came," she said. A whisper. "You actually came." What was said in that room over the next 6 hours remained a secret for 31 years. But at the end of that night, Elizabeth gave Johnny something, and that object would change everything. Near dawn, Elizabeth was sitting at the small table in the hotel room. In her hands was the brass room key, her fingers turning it over, feeling the raised 714 inches on its surface. Johnny stood by the window, watching the Roman dawn. "Take this," Elizabeth said. "This key locked me in this room, and you came and opened it. If one day either of us starts to forget what happened, what could have happened but didn't, we will look at this key and remember." Johnny took it, put it in his pocket, and for 31 years that key stayed in his drawer. Through 3 marriages, through countless moves, he never lost it. But for Elizabeth Taylor to see that brass key again, it would take 31 years and Johnny Carson's final week. Now we return to 1992, March 14th. The day the envelope arrived, when Johnny looked at the photograph, the Roman dawn, 2 silhouettes, 31 years collapsed in an instant. She had sent it because her decision was made. Before Johnny left the stage, this silence had to end. March 20th, 1992. When Elizabeth Taylor arrived at the studio, she had a small velvet pouch with her. Before taping, she spent 5 minutes alone with Johnny backstage. What was said in those 5 minutes was never known. But what the stage manager saw was this. When Johnny emerged from that room, his face was pale, his note cards had been left on the table, and in his eyes, in the eyes of the Johnny Carson he had watched for 30 years, there was something he had never seen before. Something that had never happened in 4,531 episodes of The Tonight Show was about to happen. 5:30 p.m. Taping began. Johnny's monologue was technically flawless. Election jokes, Grammy commentary. The audience laughed at all the right moments. Ed McMahon laughed beside him. Doc Severinsen's orchestra filled the pauses. But the stage manager noticed something. Between jokes, Johnny kept glancing at the curtain, not at the note cards, not at the audience, at the curtain. With the look of a man waiting for something he both desperately wanted and desperately feared. At 6:04 p.m., Ed McMahon leaned toward his microphone. The orchestra shifted into something sweeping and cinematic. "Ladies and gentlemen, 2-time Academy Award winner, star of Cleopatra and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Elizabeth Taylor." The studio erupted, not applause, something bigger. The sound that happens when 300 people simultaneously realize they are in the presence of something rare. Elizabeth came through the curtain in a deep burgundy dress, graceful but unperformed. the natural bearing of someone who had been photographed for decades, and she was looking directly at Johnny, with an expression no guest had ever worn, not the practiced smile, not the professional warmth. Something raw, something that looked like relief. The first 12 minutes were everything the producers had hoped: AIDS advocacy, the foundation she had built, the loss of Rock Hudson, sharp, funny, deeply moving, and utterly in command of the room. But beneath it ran a current, something the cameras were catching without quite understanding what they were seeing. Then Johnny set down his note cards. He leaned forward, and skipping every prepared question that the 5 backstage minutes had erased from his mind, he asked a single question. "Elizabeth, you have faced things throughout your life that would have destroyed most people. I want to ask you something I do not usually ask. What saved you? Not any one time. In general, what keeps a person going when everything is falling apart?" The studio went quiet. Elizabeth looked at him, looked at her hands, looked back at him, and the wall she had been holding in place for 12 minutes quietly came down. "There was a night," she said. Her voice had changed entirely. Slow, low, stripped of performance. "A very long time ago, a night when I was very young and very frightened, and I made a decision that night that I have thought about almost every day since." Johnny did not move, did not speak, simply waited. It was 1961. November. I was in Rome. Cleopatra was finished. My marriage was finished. Everything was finished. And I was in a hotel room, room 714, 7th floor, the Grand Hotel, completely alone, and I had decided. She paused. "Do you understand what I mean?" "Yes," Johnny said, quietly. "Stay with me. Because what comes next is the part that changes everything." At 3 in the morning I made a phone call. There was only one person I could call. One person. I knew everyone famous, presidents, kings, studio heads. And the only person I could call that night was a 3-year television host from Nebraska. Elizabeth looked directly at Johnny, not at the camera, at him. "I called you, and you did something that nobody in the world knows about." 9 seconds of silence. On live television, 9 seconds is an eternity. The producer in the control room raised his hand to cut to commercial and lowered it. The camera operators held their positions by instinct. Ed McMahon had stopped breathing. "You hung up the phone," Elizabeth said. "And 9 hours later, you knocked on that door. You flew to Rome. You canceled your show. You risked your career. And you came." Her voice trembled. "When I opened that door, when I saw you, for the first time in my life, I understood that someone had dropped everything and come for me. My husbands did not come. My studio bosses did not come. My agent did not even call. You came." Johnny Carson's hands were flat on the desk. Then very slowly, in an almost imperceptible movement, he pushed the note cards aside. He wrapped his fingers around the edge of the desk. And he did something he had never done in 4,531 episodes of a 30-year television career. He stood up from behind the desk. His shoulders trembling slightly, he walked around and stood in front of Elizabeth Taylor. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, and his voice was no longer Johnny Carson's voice. 30 years of professional warmth had been stripped away. What emerged was raw, fragile, and completely unguarded. "The night I flew to you," Johnny said, "I was actually running away too." He paused. "Running from my own life. Jody was gone. My children were gone. Every night I smiled at millions and then went home and sat in the dark. In 1961, I was in my own room 714, Elizabeth. Only my room was in Manhattan." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I came to save you because," his voice cracked, "I needed something to save me. The night I knocked on your door was the first time in my life I felt that someone truly needed me. And that kept me going. For years." Elizabeth reached out and took Johnny's hand. The two of them stood there in the middle of the stage, in front of 300 people and 40 million Americans. They were not speaking. There was no need to speak, but Elizabeth Taylor was not finished yet. She reached for the velvet pouch beside her, opened it, and placed a small, tarnished brass key on Johnny Carson's desk, engraved on it, 714. The studio held its breath for a moment. Most of the audience did not understand what the object was, but Johnny did. And when he bowed his head, tears slid from his eyes, controlled, silent, but unstoppable. "I kept this for 31 years, Elizabeth said. "I gave you a copy that morning. I kept one for myself, and now I want both of them to be in the same place, with you, because that key locked me in that room, and you came and opened it." Then she turned to the camera. The studio went instantly silent, with that collective instinct that senses when Elizabeth Taylor is about to say something important. "I want to say something to the 40 million people watching tonight, because statistically, some of you are sitting in a dark room right now, the way I was sitting in 1961, the way Johnny was sitting. And that room feels like a place with no way out. It is not. Sometimes the way out is a single person knocking on your door. Sometimes it is a phone call at 3 in the morning. I am standing here because in 1961, a man from Nebraska dropped everything and came for me. And he is sitting there because I picked up the phone that night." And Elizabeth Taylor's final words would continue to echo through the remaining 13 years of Johnny Carson's life. Johnny signaled to his producer. The segment was supposed to end at 6:22. It was now 6:43, and he did not care. What happened when the cameras stopped was described by crew members present that night in nearly identical terms over the years. Johnny walked Elizabeth to the stage exit. They stopped at the curtain edge. Elizabeth turned. 13 more days, she said. 13 more days. Make them count. I will." Then Johnny took something from his pocket, a tarnished, worn brass key, the twin of hers. Elizabeth's eyes widened. She knew he had kept it for 31 years, but seeing it was different. Johnny placed the two keys side by side in his palm. "Two keys, one door," Johnny said. Elizabeth smiled. With that familiar, slightly incredulous smile of hers, she squeezed his hand and walked away. Johnny Carson stood alone at the curtain edge for a moment, then he turned back toward the studio where 30 years of his life were waiting to be concluded. The broadcast aired that night at 11:30 p.m. Before midnight, NBC's switchboard crashed. More than 14,000 calls, the highest number ever generated by a single episode in 30 years of Tonight Show history. By 6 a.m., every major television critic in America was writing about what they had witnessed. But the calls that mattered did not come from critics. Mental health crisis lines reported a 280% increase in the 48 hours following the broadcast. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline recorded it as the busiest night of the year. The letters that arrived at NBC were not fan mail. They were from people who had been genuinely reached. Veterans, young people, people in their 70s, writing for the first time that something on television had felt real. One letter was special. A 68-year-old man from Omaha, Nebraska had written it. A short letter. "I was in a dark room too. In 1961. Nobody knocked on my door, but tonight, Elizabeth Taylor told me the door can always be opened, even 31 years late. Thank you." Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show on May 22, 1992. His final monologue was characteristically modest. He thanked the audience and told one last joke, but a conversation with his producer in those weeks was later documented. "For 30 years I told myself the interviews were for the audience. That night I understood that the best conversations are not for audiences. They are for the two people having them. Everyone else just gets the chance to listen." Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005. He was 79 years old. In his Malibu home, in a bedroom drawer, two brass keys were found, side by side, Inside a small velvet pouch, engraved on them 714. Beneath the pouch, a small note in Carson's handwriting, 2 keys, 1 door, still open. Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011. She was 79 years old, the same age as Johnny. Among her personal effects, tucked inside her private Bible, a photograph was found. 1961, Grand Hotel, Rome. Dawn light filtering through a window, and the silhouette of 2 young people. On the back, in Elizabeth's handwriting, "You were the only one who came, and that was enough." Every year on November 19th, the anniversary of that phone call, Carson's assistant confirmed that Johnny placed a call to Elizabeth Taylor. The calls were never long. What was said was never recorded. Those who knew them both well said that there probably was not much left that needed words. After 31 years of silence and 1 night of television, very little remained that required them. If this story moved something inside you, subscribe right now and send it to someone who is sitting in a dark room. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And let me ask you this. Was there ever a night when someone knocked on your door that nobody else knows about? Or did you ever knock on someone else's door and never told anyone? Because right now, somewhere, someone is sitting in their own room 714. And sometimes all it takes is one person to knock.